Russia, through Sergei Lavrov at the United Nations General Assembly, officially and publicly threatened Europe with open war and even named exactly where the attack would take place. Lavrov claims that it is Europe that is preparing to seize Russian territories, specifically the Kaliningrad region, is moving its military equipment to the borders and is preparing strikes on Russian territory. Therefore, Russia is prepared to act first. Well, let me remind you, the Russians came up with exactly the same scenario when they launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Well, and Lukashenko, as you remember, even showed 4 directions from which the Ukrainian armed forces were supposedly preparing an attack. In Europe, there are more and more reports of Russian drones which are clearly spying specifically on military facilities. Moreover, Russian fighter jets are already violating the airspace of NATO countries, and in Europe they are considering shooting down Russian planes in their airspace. Russian drones are being detected more frequently near military facilities. Moreover, Russian fighter jets are violating NATO airspace, and in Europe they are considering shooting down Russian planes. Moreover, Russian fighter jets are already violating NATO airspace, and in Europe they are considering shooting down Russian planes. Moreover, Russian fighter jets are already violating the airspace, and Europe is considering its response. He reminded that in December 2021, before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia issued an ultimatum demanding NATO return to its previous borders. NATO refused to comply with this in 1997, and after that the invasion of Ukraine followed. At that time, Russia created a pretext for the invasion, NATO. They refused to back down. The Kremlin came up with the idea that NATO was already in Ukraine and started a full-scale war against our country. Thus, at that time, Russia created a casus belli to start a major war. And now, speaking at the United Nations General Assembly, Lavrov declares, next comes a long quote. Then come threats of the use of force against Russia, which is accused of almost planning to attack NATO and the European Union. President Putin has repeatedly debunked such provocations. Russia has never had such intentions, but any aggression against my country will be met with a resolute response. There should be no doubt among NATO and European Union members who persuade voters a war with Russia is inevitable, urge sacrifices, and openly take sides. They declare their preparations to attack our Kaliningrad region and other Russian territories. In other words, Lavrov is essentially announcing exactly where Russia is ready to attack Europe. Let me explain what I mean. First of all, let me point out that this very Sergei Lavrov assured the whole world, including the United Nations General Assembly, in February 2022 that Russia had no intention whatsoever of attacking Ukraine. But they attacked. That's how these unwashed Russians are. It's their nature. They lie every time they speak. That's why there's no point in believing his words. When he speaks, Vladimir Putin was debunking these myths. We're not planning to attack anyone, that's just nonsense we've heard before. Let's break down how Russia is creating a casus belli to attack Europe. And that's the second point. So here's the situation right now. Russian drones are being seen more often over NATO military sites. Drones have been seen over military bases in Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Norway, Latvia, Estonia, France, and Germany. Moreover, Russian MiG-31 fighter jets have entered Estonian airspace and approached Latvia. Moreover, Russian warships have already been spotted in the Baltic Sea, from which the drones are being launched. They're stationed with their detection sensors off. NATO countries must respond to these new threats. The alliance has stated that it will conduct even more enhanced vigilance using new multi-domain forces and assets in the Baltic Sea region. They clarified the new assets include intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance platforms, and at least one air defense frigate. The new assets will strengthen NATO's Baltic Watch mission, launched in January this year, in response to a series of incidents in which Russians damaged power cables, telecommunications lines, and gas pipelines on the floor of the Baltic Sea. NATO countries have deployed frigates, patrol aircraft, and maritime drones in this mission to protect critical infrastructure. In addition, Sweden and Finland have already deployed several combat brigades in Lapland on the border with the Russian Federation, which are intended to defend Europe in the event of a Russian attack. Moreover, the number of European troops in Finland is equal to the number of Russian troops on the other side of the border. As you know, Poland is reinforcing its border with Belarus, deploying heavy equipment and troops. Well, in other words, these are quite reasonable actions by NATO, considering that Russia is becoming increasingly aggressive and is already carrying out hybrid attacks on Europe. But Russia turns the situation around and, through Lavrov, claims that NATO countries are moving their troops to our borders to attack Russia, and therefore we must strike first. This is what they call a casus belli. Lavrov says they're trying to take Kaliningrad, so let's strike first. Moreover, Russian planes deliberately approach or even enter the airspace of the Baltic countries to provoke strikes against them. And now Lavrov declares that NATO countries will supposedly seriously regret it if they decide to shoot down Russian aerial objects in Russian airspace. This is a quote from Lavrov. In particular, Lavrov resorted to threats because a number of NATO countries stated they were ready to shoot down Russian aerial objects if they violate the airspace of NATO allies. And it's completely unclear why Lavrov brought up Russian airspace here. No one is planning to shoot down your objects in Russian airspace. In addition, there might be a caveat here that Poland said it was ready to shoot down aerial targets in Belarus. Maybe Lavrov already sees Belarus as Russia, but still. In addition, according to Lavrov, any statements and expectations that Ukraine will return to its 2022 borders are supposedly political blindness. Lavrov responded in this way to the words of United States President Donald Trump, who suggested that Ukraine is capable of regaining all its territories and possibly even going further. And here Lavrov resorted to threats, adding that if NATO helps Ukraine with this, it will greatly regret it. But that's not all. The Kremlin brings out this potato Belarusian dictator, Alexander Lukashenko, and the so-called president of Belarus threatened to fight with everything they've got if Poland shoots down Russian planes or other Russian targets. Let me remind you that in Poland they are considering a law that would allow the Polish army to act without approval. NATO and Russia to shoot down Russian aerial targets in the skies over Ukraine and Belarus if they are clearly targeting Poland. To which Lukashenko responded as follows, quote, "I have hope and faith in the Polish people. They won't let the authorities' ambitions get out of hand. What they said, they'll shoot things down. Well, let them try. Let them shoot something down or over Kaliningrad. If they shoot down something Russian there, well, then we'll have to fight with everything we've got," says Lukashenko. As you noticed, Lukashenko mentions Kaliningrad like Lavrov. Russia is clearly trying to create a casus belli to justify future provocation if it proceeds. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.